Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream Christian Bible podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Craig Bateman, and today we're going to be discussing 4th century CE Christianity. We're going to be taking a look at the way Christians are viewed have viewed their religion in the 4th century, their interpretation of the New Testament, the creeds that are coming out in the 4th century. But a lot of this conversation will be centering around Emperor Constantine and the bishops in his time. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Bateman.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. So my first question for the moment is, by the 4th century CE, how far has Christianity come? How different is it in that era compared to the prior years of its existence?
I think the thing that comes to my mind about 4th century Christianity is it's fairly fluid. I mean, we're starting to move towards more orthodox formulations of the Christian faith, but it's still very fluid as it was in the 3rd century, and by that I can, as an example, I would point to the Council of Nicaea, where really the flashpoint was over whether Christ was actually God, or was he the firstborn creation, and like a created being. And so many Christians believed that he was the firstborn of all creation and a created being versus being God himself. But the idea of Christ as God was starting to get some traction. And of course, people like Athanasius and Alexander, the Bishop of Alexandria, at the time of Nicaea, they held to the view that Christ was indeed God. But others, like Arius, of course, famous for the Arian, heresy. But it's kind of wrong to characterize it like that as belonging to Arian. Many Christians at the time believed that Jesus was the Son of God, but not God himself. And so there was quite a row over this in Alexandria, which sort of sparked off people getting really excited, and Eusebius of Caesarea says that people were coming almost to blows over it. And Constantine, after just sort of settling his empire and vanquishing his enemy in Licinius, and taking sole control of the empire, he didn't want to have to deal with difficulties in society, like people disturbing the peace and having conflicts. So he called them together at Nicaea to sort of hammer it out. I think it's important to know about Constantine, though, is that I think he would have been okay either way, in terms of what the formulation of the creed ended up being. I think he was fine. Like, he seems to favor the creed of he seemed to have favored the creed of Eusebius of Caesarea, which was kind of a compromise between the creed of Eusebius of Nicomedia and, say, more orthodox, what would later become orthodox views of people like Athanasius. And so Eusebius's creed was kind of right in the middle. It didn't really say one way or the other whether Christ was God. But yeah, so I guess Christianity, to answer your question in brief, it was still in a pretty fluid state, and the scriptures were not, the New Testament scriptures were not at this time sorted out. They were becoming more and more trusted. You see evidence in Eusebius of Caesarea's history about and his life of Constantine, about the status of the New Testament, what ended up becoming the New Testament. And of course, you've had guests on the show talk about this. And in fact, I wrote my master's thesis at Regent College in Vancouver Uh, I wrote on Origen of Alexandria's role in the formation of the New Testament canon, and so that's kind of what got me interested in Constantine. But getting back to Eusebius, at around the time of Nicaea, he was starting to, and many were starting to really put a lot of trust, as Origen of Alexandria did, in things like the four Gospels, the four main Gospels, and the letters of Paul. But of course, on the edges, there was always controversy, and I mean, even Origen himself, had doubts about some of the sort of edge work in the New Testament, like things like or edge works, I should say, things like Second and Third John. Origen made the comment, you know, maybe he didn't write them. A lot of people don't think he did. John didn't write them, but they're so short and they're okay. So let's just all get along, kind of a thing. So yeah, I think that's the best way to put it, is that you have probably a number of Christianities going on in the empire, and so Nicaea was really sort of a consolidating. Constantine wanted them to stop fighting, and so whatever they came up with as a group of bishops, I think Constantine would have been happy with. And um, it just turned out that the majority of bishops there favored the view of Athanasius, that Christ was indeed God. And so when Eusebius of Caesarea read out his, in fact, let me just go through what happened at Nicaea. The first person to read their creed was Eusebius of Nicomedia, and he was a real influential bishop, and would end up being the bishop that baptized Constantine on his deathbed. But he was definitely in the same camp as Arius. And when he read out his creed, Athanasius and maybe a couple of his friends, but at least Athanasius, ran up, if you can believe this, in front of Constantine. It was quite a childish display, but ran up and grabbed the creed out of Eusebius of Nicomedia's hands and ripped it up in front of all, because they thought it was that heretical. So Constantine next in the proceedings has Eusebius of Caesarea read out his. Now, after Constantine directs this, you can understand why Athanasius and his compatriots wouldn't be so keen to run up and start ripping things up like they did in the first instance, because here Constantine has directed specifically that the Caesarean bishop's creed be read out. And when he read it, and this is before Athanasius and Osius of Cordoba got a hold of it later and made adjustments to it, but when he read that out, like I said, it was a middle ground creed. Constantine said, "I like it." He said, "This is what I believe." He just adopted it. And so Athanasius and his friends were kind of in a difficult position, because the emperor had just said he liked it. But what ended up happening was Athanasius got a hold of the creed, and he said, "Okay, well, we want to make some adjustments to this." And so he put in, of course, the whole thing about Christ being one with God. And it wasn't a big change, just a small change, but he made a few amendments to it. And so essentially the creed that we even have today, the Nicene Creed, is mostly Eusebius of Caesarea's, but it had the amendments by Athanasius. And Athanasius made those amendments because he wanted Arius to be excommunicated. And so what happened was, the number of the bishops there were told by one of the church historians, I can't remember, it's in my thesis somewhere, but one of the church historians notes that although of the 200 and something bishops that were there, that's just a guess, we don't know exactly, some say 300, but of the bishops, a number of them were of the Arian persuasion, that Christ was the firstborn of all creation, but not God himself. But they saw kind of which way the winds were blowing, and they saw that Athanasius was not going to be lightly satisfied unless he got his way, at least to a degree. So to keep the peace, these bishops who were of an Arian persuasion signed off on the creed at the end. And even though they didn't probably completely agree with it, and so and Constantine, I think, was very proud of these bishops because his from his perspective, from what I've read in the source evidence, he just really wanted them all to get along. I mean, I think he would have taken an Arian creed, he would have taken a what we now know as the Orthodox creed. He just wanted everyone to stop fighting, because these bishops, of course, as you know, were from sea to sea. I mean, they were from the Atlantic all the way over to the Fertile Crescent. There was bishops everywhere, hundreds and hundreds of them. And so to have such a big row, Constantine saw that that was a problem going forward. And of course, he had the Donatist crisis previously to deal with, which really chafed at him. So he just really wanted to stabilize and consolidate the theological part of it, because that was what was causing people to excommunicating people and all sorts of stuff like that. So yeah, so Christianity was in a fluid state still, but it was moving towards, and this includes the scriptures, this includes beliefs on the nature of Christ, the organization of the bishops, deacons, all that. It was moving towards a more organized, a more sort of orthodox, if you will, kind of entity. But it wouldn't really get there even until you get to maybe the time of Augustine would be a good place to go if you want to know when if we want to say, okay, well, this is when the church kind of sort of had their scriptures hammered out, like Dr. Price has mentioned on the show a number of times, that Athanasius, of course, who made those emendations to the creed, he had a festal letter in 367 that said, okay, we're using these 27 and no others, right? So that's 367, and then you get into the 5th century and the 6th century, you get like Augustine and Pope Gregory the First, who sets up in Rome, starts a taxation system across what was left of the beleaguered and dying Roman Empire. And it was so it, like I say, it was diverse in the 4th century, but it wasn't it was diverse in the 4th century, but it wasn't orthodox yet. It wasn't until we get to like Augustine and Gregory that things have settled down. And even then, to call them settled down, as many of your guests, like the professors that you have on, will say, it wasn't even settled then. It took many centuries before things got settled down. But that's sort of a thumbnail sketch. If you have more specific questions about that transformation, I'm happy to entertain them.
Well, what I'm about to ask you is something that you've probably never heard of. There's a group of people out there, and they're actually spreading in number, from what I can tell. And I've interacted with a couple of them. A couple of them that believe that the Council of Nicaea is a myth, that it never happened. And I wanted to ask you about that and hear your reaction here to that pseudo historical theory.
Wow. I think first of all, my first reaction is no. That's if historical evidence and the principle of plausibility mean anything, then the number of accounts, we have like 5 separate, and I've published a Nicaean, what I call a Nicaean parallels. You know how you have gospel parallels that put passages of well, I've done a similar thing, not even close to as detailed, but I've done a similar thing with the accounts of Nicaea. And so we have like five different accounts of Nicaea, from Eusebius, from three church historians, Sozomen, Socrates, and Theodoretus, and Athanasius himself. So the idea that it didn't happen, I think, just runs directly against the evidence. We know it happened. We don't know enough. We don't know as much as we'd like to know about it, but I think we know the most important instantiations in the council. Uh, the sorting out of the date of Easter, and the whole question of the nature of whether Christ was God or not. So um, I think based on the evidence, it's an event that happened. Uh, you know, there might be questions as to how reliable some of the evidence is. And it's true that when you look at the church historians, the three that I just named, besides not including Eusebius of Caesarea or Athanasius, if you look at those three church historians, of course, they borrowed from Eusebius. And so you've heavily. And so some might want to say, well, it's just a repeating of the initial one. But there's details in their accounts that are not the same as Eusebius of Caesarea. So um, I I think, yeah, I just don't. I would be interested to know, first of all, what evidence this group has for it being a myth, and for it to be a myth, you'd have to challenge, I guess, the source documents that I've just mentioned. And those aren't the only ones. There's other ones, but they don't go into quite as much detail. So, yeah, I just think that is, unless I saw evidence that would indicate that Eusebius was creating a story from whole cloth, like as in a whole cloth hoax, then I would say there's no way. There's no way that it didn't happen. It happened for sure. I mean, the evidence, that's what the evidence tells us. I mean, like Dr. Price likes to say, we can't get in a time machine and go back and visit, unfortunately, but that's where we're at. We're left with the source documents, and so I think that we can safely say that it happened. I think what you can debate about is what happened at the council of Nicaea. But I'm comfortable with the evidence as a historian, as someone who's looked at a lot of source documents. I'm comfortable that we're talking about an event that happened, and there's good reasons why it happened. Constantine didn't do it out of religious zeal. He did it because these people were arguing with each other, and they were powerful people, and in their communities. I mean, they weren't politically powerful, but they were powerful in terms of their influence over groups of people all across his empire. And he's like, no, we're not having this. Like, let's get together and hammer it out, and you guys all agree, and we'll move forward. So yeah, I've never heard that. I mean, I think I've heard similar things, but never that it didn't happen. But I think, yeah, no, it's that's a fascinating. I'd love to see more evidence.
When you look at the Trinity and the way the Christians are viewing the Trinity in the 4th century CE, we have prior mentions of the Trinity and the Didache, even in Matthew and First John,
Mm-hmm.
and First Peter as well. So we have these. We have obviously 3 of them are New Testament texts, with the Didache being outside the New Testament. And the Trinity, the way that it's viewed there is not necessarily that 3 people are the same person.
Right.
It's more like there's 3 powers. So the way they look at the Trinity there is different from what happens in the 3rd century CE when we get Tertullian. And Tertullian states that, no, actually, these are 3 substances of the same deity. Would you agree that the Trinity was basically redefined by Tertullian, and then in the 4th century CE, it was Tertullian's version of the Trinity that was obviously adopted?
Okay, so Tertullian you're saying that it went from a group of it went from people saying that it was three powers to one person. Is that what you're saying?
That's what it looks like to me in some way.
Right.
It's something like that.
Yeah, it's I have to admit up front, I don't consider myself an expert on Trinitarianism or uh, that whole field. Uh, I I just know that it was very important to Athanasius and his crowd. I mean, one of the interesting things about the whole debate with Alexander, Bishop Alexander of Alexandria, and Arius, is that when they were first having their meetings, their debates, or whatever, one of the historians, I think it's Socrates, it could be Sosman, notes that at first when they were debating, Bishop Alexander agreed with Arius, but then he swung the other way and didn't agree with him. So, like that kind of shows you the fluidity of the whole situation. But, but definitely Athanasius wanted wanted the creed to reflect his view, and I'm not sure that Christ was indeed of the same nature and was God. You know, like I think the real sticking point was he didn't like the idea of thinking of Christ as the firstborn of all creation, as being a created being. He really wanted to hammer home the idea that no, Christ was God in human form, and so I think to get a more definite answer, definitely you'd have to talk to someone who studied the Trinity at length. I mean, of course, I think as some of your guests have said, the Trinity itself is kind of a mystery. I mean, how do you conceptualize? Like, what do you mean when you say that the three parts of the Trinity are one? Like, what does that mean, right? I I just don't. I think it's a very complex thing, but it looks to me as if you're saying that they're going from three powers to one person. That yeah, I don't think I would say that Athanasius would be more along the lines of Tertullian, in that it's one person, because I don't think he'd want to see Christ as merely a power, like a team. You know what I mean? Like a team of three. Um, I think he'd want to really emphasize the fact that um, that actually, no, Christ. We can say that Christ is God. So yeah, and then the New Testament references you make to that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some of your guests have suggested that uh, even though those formulations are used, we're not sure that, like, if someone says, and we bless you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and someone says, aha, the Trinity. I think some of your guests have noted that, well, that's not really the doctrine of the Trinity there. You know what I mean? Again, it's almost more like of an early formulation, like you were just saying, of three powers. Um, but I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think the Trinity was redefined by Tertullian. That's kind of where I go. That's kind of what I go with right now. But we have a super chat question. A Muslim apologist. Thank you for the super chat. Was Arius set up to fail at the council?
I mean, definitely in Athanasius's mind, yes, that's exactly right. The changes that Athanasius made to Eusebius of Caesarea's creed were specifically designed to get Arius excommunicated. Um, when Constantine called the council, he didn't call the council. I don't think he had any idea that, look, we've got to get rid of this Arius guy. So let's call a council and get him. No, that's completely that would be Athanasius and Alexander and perhaps some others. I keep going back to Athanasius because he's the real sort of I don't know, he's like the epicenter of that movement. And there's others, but it's hard to gauge. But yes, your question, you're exactly right. I mean, in Athanasius's mind, Arius was on his way out. He Athanasius would have probably not agreed to anything unless Arius got booted out. And so he got his wish because, like I said before, the many of the bishops who were Arian leaning, if and I know that calling it the Arian controversy is a little bit of a misnomer, but I do that just for convenience. But like I said before, a lot of the bishops who were Arian leaning just saw which way the wind was going, and they just thought, you know what, I'm just going to sign off on this thing to keep the peace. At least that's what we're told. I mean, we're just going on the source evidence here. I don't, of course, how could I know? But yeah, you're exactly right. He was that was Athanasius's goal, is to get Arians sent packing, and it worked. But I should say that within a few years, like one classic statement on the Council of Nicaea that I like is from one of my favorite authors on Constantine, R.M. Grant, an American scholar, and he comments that within a couple years, 2 or 3 years of the Council of Nicaea, it was a dead letter in terms of because again, what happened was the Arians kind of retrenched. They sort of reorganized, and they were willing to sign off on the creed eventually, and even Arius himself was willing to sign off on the creed. But I think one of the reasons they were is because, like I said before, with Eusebius of Caesarea's creed, it was a creed that could go either way. Of course, Athanasius made adjustments to it that made it very difficult, but Constantine welcomed Arius back into the Christian church, a few years later. And so that's what Robert M. Grant was talking about when he said it was in 2 or 3 years, it was a dead letter, meaning that, yeah, there was an excommunication, and there was prohibitions. An edict was created that said that Arian's writings were prohibited, or Arius's writings were prohibited, and anyone caught secreting them and on would be punished. But that all just kind of fell away. And so, but that's right. Yeah, the question is right on. He was at least in Athanasius's mind, that was the goal, is to get Arius out.
So at the conclusion at the Council of Nicaea, where do you see Christianity at that point? Like, how much of it has changed, and how long did that effect go on? Did most of the creedal statements in Nicaea get preserved in later creeds, like at Constantinople and other councils that came out later?
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of the things the decisions they made at Nicaea, there was a number of canons, like a handful of what became to be known as canons, like rulings, essentially rulings. If you think of it as a court, they made rulings on specific points. And, one of them, for an example, was on the fact that it was prohibited for people to castrate themselves, which sounds crazy. But of course, they were doing that. They were even talking about that because of Origen of Alexandria, who did exactly that. And of course, Origen did that in his religious passion and zeal. He was young. Eusebius said, he did that, but we can't judge him for that. I mean, he just did that. He was trying to do everything he could to be a better disciple. And but later Christians thought that was ridiculous, and of course it is. I mean, there's no need to do that. But so they came up with some rulings on various points. They weren't that controversial. I mean, things like you couldn't move, a bishop couldn't just of his own accord, if he was a powerful man, because they all were at that time. And in fact, I guess in a lot of places they still are, although I guess there's some churches that are changing. But that a bishop just couldn't up and change the see, like the area that they were in charge of. And I think Eusebius of Nicomedia had done that. And this again was another ruling specifically aimed at an event that had happened. Someone did that. Someone just, they were powerful. They wanted to go to a more influential seat as a bishop, and the council said, no, you can't do that. So um, the things weren't very controversial. They're very straightforward. So, but it's a good point to raise that at that council, there were laws created, which of course the church would carry with them for the rest of their existence, right? And at other councils, they would do the same thing. They would create rulings on various points. Um, so, as to your question about where was Christianity at the end of the Council of Nicaea, well, I mean, I think maybe a good place to go is the banquet that Constantine invited them to. So after the council, um, Constantine invited the bishops to stay on and celebrate his anniversary as emperor, whatever it was, 20 years or something, I can't remember. But and at this banquet, you have these, and outside of the building where the banquet was held, you have Roman guards stationed all around, and the Romans are, in a line as the bishops walk into this big hall for a feast. And there they are at supper with the emperor, the Roman emperor, and these bishops. And you can imagine it was just a very, I'm sure Constantine wanted everyone to be happy and celebratory and eating and drinking and enjoying themselves. I mean, so if you ask where the Christian church was at the end of the Council of Nicaea, well, they were fully ensconced. I mean, this was a sort of a mirror. This was like a what do you want to call it? It was a small snapshot of the larger reality that the Christian church was becoming a part of the constitution of the Roman Empire. Constantine's, I mean, and at that banquet, after the banquet was over, he gave them gifts of money. Of course, he paid for their travel to and from the council, so it was all on the state's expense. And Constantine doled out, huge sums of money in rebuilding broken down churches, whether they were broken down during the persecutions, or whether they were just old. He gave them benefactions of state funds to rebuild those churches, and of course build lots of new ones. And so here we see a Roman emperor, and this is kind of goes into where my thesis focuses on is Constantine started, well, he started before this, like well before this, but legislating about bishops and the kinds of perks they got, absolved from taxation or having to serve in public office. And so by making laws about them, he was really bringing the Christian church into the constitution of the Roman Empire, into the, the legal framework. And so where was the Christian church? It was like, I think Nicaea, I've often thought that Nicaea is kind of like in some ways like a wedding. And it's the marriage of church and state. It's the marriage of the Christian church to the Roman Empire, essentially. Under Constantine, granted, there wasn't any contract signed up that said, now the Christian church is beholden. No, nothing like that. Constantine was happy to let them, sort out their difficulties. But when they couldn't sort it out, as with the Donatist crisis previous to that and the Nicene crisis, he stepped in. And so that was a precedent-setting thing. And then in future councils, of course, the Roman emperor, it was the same kind of thing where the state was kind of, at least for a while it was. Of course, the Western Empire fell within, 100 years of Nicaea, maybe a little longer, because it was a long process of devolution. Of course, the Eastern Empire lasted a long time. And you get like Justinian and stuff like that, and you remember. I mean, we all know how involved he was with, with lawmaking, and by that time the church was fully, the empire was fully Christian. I mean, with quotation marks, right? I mean, it's not to say that everyone in the empire was Christian. And that's another thing with Constantine. Even though this was going on, this process of the two becoming one, like the church and state, it's, people shouldn't think that means that even 50% of the population was Christian. Not at all. It wasn't until like 350 or later, according to Rodney Stark, that the empire's population would be somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 50% Christian in like 350 to 360. I've got the exact details in my thesis, but at the time of Nicaea, I don't know, maybe 15%, 10 or 15%. But after Constantine, of course, after he had adopted the Christian religion, you can understand why. And of course, subsequent emperors, excepting Julian, all went along with Constantine's choice. And so you can understand why the population became more and more, they more and more adopted it. And of course, there's in the late 4th century, there was a law referred to as Cunctus Populus by Theodosius that declared Christianity the state religion. And again, as we get further away from Constantine, I don't pretend expertise in all of these matters, especially when you get into the 5th century or the late 4th and 5th, because there is so much information on these and so much source material that I just don't claim expertise. But a later emperor basically said through this law that Christianity is now the official religion of the empire. But of course, that's years after Constantine, 20, 30 years after Constantine at least. Maybe more. And so if you're asking me where was the church at, that's the big thing that I see is, and of course, because Constantine was showering them with gifts and building churches for them left and right, they became a more and more formidable presence on the ground level. I mean, they couldn't help, it had to be. I mean, people, when they wake up in the morning and go to work, see a new church being built. Well, what's this? You know what I mean? And over time, those kinds of things get established and people start adopting the emperor's religion as it became eventually. And so, I think this is the beginning. This is like the marriage of church and state, although it took a long time for the marriage to get into full swing and start to bear children, if we will. It wasn't until like the Middle Ages that it really got kind of out of control in terms of the church taking on far more political responsibility. And that's another thing I'll say in passing is that, when Constantine did this, he was doing it, I think, to solidify his own rule and reign. He was grooming his sons, of course, to take over after him, and they did. And the bishops and the Christian church all across the empire were like outposts of social control, if you will, or influence at least, where you had these bishops who had been lavished on by Constantine gifts and money and churches. And so, of course, they were very beholden to Constantine. And so Constantine knew that. He was a smart emperor. He had been trained in the business of being an emperor since he was young at the court of Galerius, what became, anyway, he was, as a young person, as a son of Constantius, he was brought up at the court of the court of Diocletian became the court of Galerius, and that's where he was trained. And so he was doing this to solidify his own rule and reign. He would have no idea or no wish, I don't think, that the church would ever get involved to the degree they did get involved in governing the lives of people in terms of how it turned out to be in the Middle Ages. I don't think he didn't want that at all. He wanted the Roman state and the government to continue. He wanted his sons to run it, and they did. And he wanted the church there as his right hand, his right hand man, if we can use that, his right hand person. And they were. But eventually, when the Roman Empire fell in the West, you have like Pope Gregory in Rome, and there's no, like, the Roman Empire in the West was disintegrating. And so he kind of had to sort of organize troops to defend Rome and start his own taxation system with the churches. And it's really fascinating stuff. Again, this is not an area that is my expertise, but that transformation from, say, the from Pope Gregory to when you get into like the 11th and 12th century, the church became more and more involved in organizing and sort of ruling essentially over people's lives, marriage law, contract law, all that stuff. And so like James Brundage writes about this, and you can see it in my thesis. Yeah, so that's what I think. That's in terms of where they were at the beginning of a new relationship with the state. Of course, it had started before this. It had started, maybe, I don't know, like in earnest. It had probably started when the rigorists and the Donus controversy had appealed the decision of making Caecilian the bishop of Carthage, and they didn't like that. So they went to Constantine and said, hey, we're appealing this. We don't think this decision was right. And so that's how Constantine got involved with that. But that was kind of one of the first big steps of the church-state relationship. And then Nicaea was just, like I say, it was like it was kind of like a wedding,
Well, thanks for joining me today, Dr. Bateman.
Yeah, happy to join you anytime. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I thank everybody for listening. I'll see you guys next time.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.